The calm before the storm. Sophia Carter clutched her son Daniel's hand tightly as they approached the gate for their long-awaited flight. The airport buzzed with the energy of travelers rushing to destinations far and wide. Families herding children, solo adventurers with oversized backpacks, and professionals lugging sleek suitcases. For Sophia and Daniel, this wasn't just a vacation, it was an escape. After months of long hours at her nursing job, Sophia had scraped together enough money to treat her 6-year-old son to a trip to the sandy beaches of Miami. Daniel, his wide brown eyes filled with wonder, clutched his new sketchpad under one arm and an action figure in the other. "Mom, do you think the plane will fly higher than the clouds?" he asked, his voice bubbling with excitement. Sophia smiled, brushing a stray curl from her face. "Oh, much higher, baby. We'll be so high up, it'll feel like we're touching the stars." They boarded with ease, settling into their seats near the window. Sophia helped Daniel fasten his seatbelt before reaching into her bag for snacks and coloring pencils. The flight was already buzzing with pre-takeoff activity. Attendants closing overhead compartments, passengers making last-minute calls, and the intercom crackling with announcements. As Daniel pressed his face to the window, marveling at the maze of airplanes and luggage carts below, Sophia couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. This was their first trip together, and she was determined to make it memorable. The man across the aisle smiled kindly at her, his salt and pepper beard giving him a distinguished look. "First flight?" he asked, nodding toward Daniel. Sophia nodded. "First one ever. He's been talking about it for weeks." The man chuckled, returning to his book, while Sophia focused on keeping Daniel entertained as the final boarding call echoed through the cabin. Everything felt normal, until it wasn't. As the engines roared to life, and the plane began its taxi to the runway, a sharp click of heels announced the arrival of a flight attendant moving briskly through the aisle. Nancy, as her name had agreed, carried herself with the precision and authority of someone who took her job very seriously. Her crisp uniform and tightly pulled-back hair gave her an air of professionalism that bordered on intimidating. Daniel leaned slightly into the aisle to catch a better glimpse of the flight attendants preparing for takeoff. His small fingers gripped the armrest as he peeked around, curiosity lighting up his face. It was harmless, a child's innocent enthusiasm, but Nancy's eyes zeroed in on him like a hawk spotting prey. "Sit properly in your seat, young man," she snapped, her voice cutting through the hum of the engines. Daniel recoiled instantly, his smile vanishing as he scooted back into his seat. Sophia turned to Nancy, startled by the sharpness of her tone. "He's just excited," Sophia explained calmly, placing a protective hand on her son's arm. "It's his first flight." Nancy's lips tightened, her expression unreadable. "This isn't a playground, ma'am. He needs to remain seated for his safety and everyone else's." The volume of her voice carried beyond their row, and heads began to turn. Sophia felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment as murmurs rippled through the nearby passengers. "I understand," Sophia said evenly, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. She tightened her grip on Daniel's arm, signaling to him to stay put. Nancy lingered for a moment, her eyes narrowing as if she expected further resistance. When none came, she muttered something under her breath and strode back down the aisle. Sophia's heart pounded as she looked at Daniel, who now stared down at his sketchpad, his excitement replaced by quiet confusion. "Did I do something wrong, Mom?" he asked softly. "No, sweetheart. You did nothing wrong," Sophia whispered, kissing the top of his head. But her stomach churned with unease. The interaction had left a sour taste in her mouth, one that carried the bitterness of something far too familiar. 2 rows ahead, in the first-class cabin, James Reed adjusted his cufflinks and glanced up from his tablet. He had witnessed the exchange, his keen eyes taking in every detail, the child's innocent curiosity, the mother's calm response, and the flight attendant's unnecessarily harsh tone. James was a man of action, though he preferred to observe before intervening. Years of navigating high-stakes negotiations as a corporate lawyer had taught him the value of patience. But as he watched Sophia gently comfort her son, he felt a flicker of anger rise within him. This wasn't about protocol. James had seen this dynamic play out far too often. A subtle, insidious form of judgment disguised as authority. The look in Nancy's eyes when she spoke to the mother and son told him everything he needed to know. James leaned back in his seat, tapping his fingers thoughtfully against the armrest. He didn't know Sophia or Daniel, but that didn't matter. What mattered was ensuring that moments like this didn't go unchecked. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Sophia tried to shake off the incident, focusing on Daniel's sketches instead. He was drawing the airplane, his tiny hands carefully outlining the wings and the clouds outside the window. His joy was returning, but Sophia could still feel the weight of Nancy's words lingering in the air. Across the aisle, the older man with the leather-bound book glanced at Sophia briefly before returning to his reading. He, too, had seen what happened but seemed content to stay silent. Most passengers were. The uncomfortable truth was that while many noticed, few acted. Nancy moved briskly through the cabin, handing out drinks and snacks with the same clipped efficiency. Her expression was unreadable, but her stiff posture betrayed a tension that hadn't been there before. James noticed it too as he observed her from his seat. He could see the cracks forming in her carefully maintained facade. She wasn't just strict, she was defensive, her every movement tinged with a subtle edge of bitterness. James made his decision. Rising from his seat, he adjusted his tie and stepped into the aisle, his tall frame moving with deliberate calm. He wasn't looking to create a scene, but he also wasn't going to let this slide. As he approached the galley where Nancy was rearranging trays, he cleared his throat. The soft sound was enough to make her turn, her eyes narrowing slightly as she recognized him from first class. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her tone polite but guarded. James tilted his head slightly, meeting her gaze evenly. "I'd like to speak with you about your interaction with the young boy earlier," he said, his voice calm but firm. Nancy stiffened, her fingers tightening around the edge of the beverage cart. "Is there an issue?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. James took a step closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "There is. And I think you know exactly what I'm talking about." For a moment, Nancy said nothing, her lips pressed into a thin line. James continued, his words deliberate and measured. "You weren't enforcing safety rules back there. You were making assumptions, and whether you realize it or not, every passenger in that cabin saw it." Nancy's face flushed faintly, but she quickly masked it with a practiced professionalism. "I didn't mean to offend anyone," she said, lifting her chin slightly. "I was just doing my job." James nodded slowly, his expression unyielding. Doing your job is important, but so is how you treat people while you're doing it. Back in her seat, Sophia glanced down the aisle and caught a glimpse of James speaking to Nancy. She didn't know who he was or why he had stepped in, but for the first time since boarding, she felt a small flicker of relief. Someone had noticed, and someone cared enough to act. When silence breaks, Sophia sat quietly in her seat, the hum of the airplane engines filling the space around her. She tried to focus on Daniel, who was now sketching clouds and airplanes with the kind of concentration only children possess. But her thoughts drifted back to the exchange with Nancy, the flight attendant. It wasn't just the words, it was the tone, the look in her eyes. It felt like a dismissal, not just of Daniel's curiosity, but of their very presence on the plane. Sophia had dealt with moments like this before. The quick, cutting remarks, the sharp looks that didn't quite meet her eyes, the unspoken message that she and her son didn't belong. It wasn't new, but it never got easier. "Mom," Daniel said softly, breaking her reverie. "Do you think the clouds look like marshmallows?" Sophia smiled, her heart aching at his innocence. "Maybe, baby. Do you want to draw them as marshmallows?" Daniel giggled and nodded, his little fingers darting across the page to transform the puffy clouds into a whimsical world of marshmallow shapes. His laughter eased some of the tension in Sophia's chest, but the knot was still there, refusing to unravel. Across the aisle, the older man with the leather-bound book shifted uncomfortably. He had been watching, though he pretended not to. His eyes darted toward Sophia briefly, before returning to his book, his guilt evident in the way he avoided her gaze. Like so many others, he had seen what happened but chose silence. At the front of the plane, James Reed stood in the galley with Nancy. His posture was calm, almost casual, but his eyes were sharp, unyielding. Nancy, on the other hand, looked visibly uncomfortable, her professional demeanor faltering under his quiet scrutiny. "You weren't enforcing safety," James said again, his tone even but firm. "You were making an assumption. And whether you intended to or not, that assumption hurt someone." Nancy crossed her arms, her fingers digging into the fabric of her uniform. "I was doing my job," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. James tilted his head slightly, his gaze piercing. "If you were doing your job, then why did the entire cabin go silent when you spoke to that boy? Why did you feel the need to raise your voice?" Nancy's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't see how this concerns you, sir." "It concerns me because I was watching," James replied. "And so was everyone else. That mother, that child, they'll carry this moment with them long after this flight is over. And you'll forget it as soon as you step off this plane." Nancy blinked, her defenses wavering. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. James took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You might not think it matters," he continued, "but it does. Dignity matters. Respect matters. And if you can't give that to every passenger, maybe you're in the wrong line of work." For a moment, there was silence. Nancy looked down, her hands trembling faintly. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond to a truth she couldn't deny. James didn't wait for her reply. Instead, he stepped back, giving her the space to process his words. Back in the cabin, Rachel, the younger flight attendant, moved down the aisle with the beverage cart. Her warm smile and kind words were a stark contrast to Nancy's earlier demeanor. When she reached Sophia and Daniel's row, she crouched down to Daniel's level, holding out a small packet of cookies. "For our little artist," Rachel said with a wink. Daniel's face lit up. "Thank you." Sophia offered Rachel a grateful smile. "That's very kind of you." Rachel shrugged. "It's no trouble. He's a good kid." As Rachel moved on, Sophia noticed how the atmosphere in the cabin seemed to shift. Passengers relaxed, their earlier discomfort easing under Rachel's warmth. But the knot in Sophia's chest remained. Kindness didn't erase what had happened. It only softened the edges. At the back of the plane, Nancy stood by the galley, gripping the edge of the counter. Her hands trembled as she rearranged napkins and cups, the movements mechanical, almost frantic. James's words echoed in her mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. She glanced toward the cabin, her eyes landing on Rachel as she interacted with passengers. The younger flight attendant's easy grace and natural warmth only served to highlight Nancy's own shortcomings. A bitter taste filled her mouth as she watched Rachel crouch beside Sophia, her smile lighting up the row. Nancy turned away sharply, her jaw clenched. She didn't need to be told how to do her job, especially not by a man like James Reed. But the truth was, she felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she hadn't experienced before. It was like James had peeled back a layer of her armor, leaving her raw and uncertain. As the flight continued, James returned to his seat, his gaze sweeping over the cabin. He noticed the way passengers interacted with Rachel, their smiles genuine and unforced. He also noticed the way Nancy avoided their eyes, her movements stiff and deliberate. James leaned back, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. He wasn't done. Not yet. This wasn't just about Nancy or even about Sophia and Daniel. It was about something bigger, something that couldn't be ignored. When Rachel passed by his row, James signaled to her. "Can I have a word?" he asked, his voice low. Rachel nodded, stepping closer. "Of course. Keep an eye on Nancy," James said quietly. "If anything else happens, let me know." Rachel's brows furrowed, concern flickering in her eyes. "Is everything okay?" "It will be," James replied, "but only if we make sure it is." As the plane cruised through the sky, Sophia tucked a blanket over Daniel's lap. He had fallen asleep, his head resting against her arm, his sketchpad still clutched in his hand. She stroked his curls gently, her heart aching for him. Sophia's gaze drifted toward the front of the cabin, where Nancy stood near the galley. For a moment, their eyes met, and Sophia saw something she hadn't expected: guilt. It was faint, barely there, but it was enough to make her pause. Maybe Nancy wasn't as impervious as she seemed. Maybe, just maybe, there was a crack in her armor. But Sophia wasn't ready to forgive. Not yet. Her priority was Daniel, and ensuring he felt safe and loved, no matter what. As she leaned back in her seat, she whispered softly, more to herself than to anyone else, "You're okay, baby. You're okay." And as the plane soared through the clouds, carrying them closer to their destination, Sophia held her son a little tighter, determined to protect him from a world that too often sought to dim his light. The weight of accountability. Nancy lingered in the galley, staring blankly at the stack of neatly folded napkins she had rearranged for the third time. The hum of the engines vibrated softly through the cabin, but the noise in her head was deafening. James Reed's words replayed over and over, cutting through her carefully constructed sense of control. "You need to decide which version of yourself you want to be when this plane lands." The statement had burrowed under her skin. At first, she had dismissed it as an unnecessary lecture from a passenger who thought too highly of himself. But the more she tried to shake it off, the heavier it became, pressing down like an invisible weight on her chest. Nancy exhaled sharply and looked around the galley. Rachel had taken over most of the passenger service, chatting easily with travelers as she moved up and down the aisle. The younger woman carried herself with an effortless warmth that Nancy had always envied, but never quite understood. It wasn't that Nancy didn't care about her job. She did. But somewhere along the way, her focus had shifted. What once felt like an opportunity to connect with people had turned into a daily battle for authority and control. Nancy's fingers tightened around the edge of the counter as she replayed the moment with the boy, Daniel. She hadn't intended to come across as harsh, or had she? The look on the mother's face, Sophia, had been unmistakable. Hurt, anger, and something deeper. The quiet resignation of someone who had been here before, too many times to count. In the main cabin, Sophia watched as Daniel stirred slightly in his sleep. His sketchpad had slipped from his hands, falling to the floor with a soft thud. She reached down to retrieve it, her movements careful not to wake him. As she straightened, her eyes landed on Rachel, who was now helping an elderly woman adjust her seatbelt. Rachel caught her gaze and smiled. It wasn't forced or polite. It was genuine. For a brief moment, the tension in Sophia's chest loosened. She knew people like Rachel, people who didn't just go through the motions but actually cared. It was a stark contrast to Nancy, whose clipped words and judgmental stare still lingered in her mind. Sophia's thoughts drifted back to James. She had noticed him speaking to Nancy earlier, his posture calm but commanding. She didn't know who he was, but there was something about him that felt reassuring. It wasn't just that he had noticed the exchange, it was that he had acted. That kind of courage was rare, and Sophia couldn't help but feel grateful, even if she didn't fully understand his motivations. James, seated in the first-class cabin, glanced down at his tablet but found himself unable to focus. His mind kept returning to the interaction with Nancy. He had seen her type before, people who wore their authority like armor, using it to shield themselves from their own insecurities. But he also knew that people like Nancy weren't beyond redemption. They just needed to be held accountable, to be reminded of the humanity they so often overlooked. He tapped his fingers lightly on the armrest, his thoughts interrupted by Rachel as she passed by. "Mr. Reed," she said softly, leaning in. "Is everything okay?" James looked up, his expression thoughtful. "That depends. How's Nancy?" Rachel hesitated, her smile faltering slightly. "She's tense. I think your words hit a nerve." "They were supposed to," James replied evenly. "But this isn't about punishing her. It's about making sure she understands the impact of her actions." Rachel nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "She's been with the airline for a long time. Maybe too long. Sometimes I think she's forgotten why she started in the first place." James leaned back in his seat, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Then maybe it's time she remembers." Nancy couldn't avoid the passengers forever. As the plane began its descent, she stepped out of the galley and into the aisle, her posture stiff and her gaze avoiding contact. She moved mechanically, collecting empty cups and discarded wrappers, her smile forced and brittle. When she reached Sophia and Daniel's row, she hesitated. Daniel was awake now, his eyes still heavy with sleep, but filled with curiosity as he scribbled on his sketchpad. Sophia glanced up, her expression guarded. Nancy cleared her throat. "Ma'am, I'll need to ensure your son is properly seated for landing." Sophia straightened, her tone calm but firm. "I'll adjust his seatbelt when it's time." Nancy's lips pressed into a thin line. The tension between them was palpable, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. For a moment, it seemed like Nancy might press further, but then James appeared at the end of the aisle. "Miss Smith," he said, his voice steady but commanding. "Is there an issue here?" Nancy froze, her eyes darting toward James. "No, sir," she replied stiffly. "Just ensuring protocol is followed." James stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "Good. Then I trust you'll respect the mother's judgment." Nancy muttered a faint acknowledgement and quickly retreated toward the galley. Sophia exhaled slowly, her shoulders sagging with relief. James lingered for a moment, his eyes meeting Sophia's. There was no need for words. His presence said enough. As the plane made its final approach, Nancy stood by the galley, gripping the edge of the counter. She could feel the weight of James's gaze, even though she couldn't see him. His words from earlier echoed in her mind, louder now than before. "Would you have spoken to a different child the same way?" The question gnawed at her, forcing her to confront truths she had long buried. The truth was, she wouldn't have. And that realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Nancy glanced down the aisle, her eyes landing on Sophia and Daniel. The boy was laughing softly as he showed his mother his latest drawing. A plane soaring through a sky of marshmallow clouds. There was an innocence to his joy, a purity that reminded Nancy of something she had lost long ago. Her chest tightened as memories she had tried to forget came rushing back. Memories of her own childhood, of moments when she had been made to feel small, unseen, unworthy. She had promised herself she would never let anyone make her feel that way again. But in her quest to protect herself, she had become the very thing she despised. Nancy swallowed hard, the lump in her throat making it difficult to breathe. She knew she couldn't undo what had happened, but maybe, just maybe, she could start to make it right. As the plane touched down and the passengers began to disembark, Nancy positioned herself near the door, her posture stiff, but her expression conflicted. She watched as Sophia and Daniel approached, the mother's protective arm draped around her son. "Ma'am," Nancy said softly, her voice trembling slightly. Sophia stopped, her eyes narrowing cautiously. "I want to apologize," Nancy continued, her gaze dropping briefly before meeting Sophia's. "For earlier, I shouldn't have spoken to you or your son that way." Sophia studied her for a moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded, her voice quiet but firm. "Thank you." As Sophia and Daniel stepped into the terminal, Nancy felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Humility. It wasn't enough to erase what had happened, but it was a start. And for the first time in years, Nancy realized that starting over might not be such a bad thing after all. the spark that ignited change. The terminal was buzzing with the usual post-flight chaos. Passengers rushing to retrieve luggage, families reuniting, and announcements crackling over the intercom. But Sophia didn't notice any of it. She held Daniel's hand tightly, her mind replaying the events of the flight like a reel she couldn't shut off. "Mom, are we going to the hotel now?" Daniel asked, his voice bright, blissfully unaware of the tension still gripping her. "Yes, sweetheart," Sophia replied with a forced smile. "We'll grab our bags and head straight there. You'll love it. It has a pool." Daniel's eyes lit up. "A pool? Can we go swimming today?" "We'll see," Sophia said, her voice soft. She didn't have the heart to dampen his excitement, even though her own energy felt drained. She glanced back briefly, catching a glimpse of Nancy standing at the gate, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable. The apology had been a start, but it wasn't enough to erase the sting of the earlier interaction. Back on the plane, James lingered near the cockpit, speaking quietly with the captain. The flight crew moved around him, busy with post-flight duties, but their movements slowed as they passed him, their curiosity evident. Nancy stayed near the galley, folding napkins and rearranging cups with mechanical precision. Her mind was racing, the weight of the day pressing down on her like a stone. James's words had been blunt, unflinching, and they had cut through her defenses in a way she hadn't expected. When James finally approached her, she straightened instinctively, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "Miss Smith," he began, his tone measured but firm. "Do you have a moment?" Nancy nodded, though her throat felt tight. "Of course." James gestured toward an empty row of seats, away from the bustling crew. She followed him, her heart pounding in her chest. Once they were seated, James leaned forward, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. "I'm going to be straightforward with you," he said, his voice calm but unwavering. "What happened on this flight can't happen again." Nancy opened her mouth to respond, but he held up a hand, stopping her. "Let me finish," he said. "This isn't about shaming you or making you feel small. It's about accountability. It's about recognizing that your actions, however small they might seem to you, have a ripple effect." Nancy's lips tightened, but she stayed silent, her gaze fixed on her hands. "I've spent years dealing with people in positions of authority," James continued, "and I've seen what happens when they misuse that authority, whether intentionally or not. It's not always about malice. Sometimes it's about habits, biases, or simply forgetting that every person you interact with is carrying their own weight." Nancy's fingers tightened around the edge of her uniform. "I wasn't trying to be malicious," she said quietly. "I was just enforcing the rules." James nodded. "And I believe you. But here's the thing. How you enforce the rules matters. That mother and her son, they weren't just passengers to you. They became a target for your frustration, whether you realized it or not." Nancy swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I didn't mean for it to come across that way." "I know," James said, his tone softening slightly. "But intent doesn't erase impact, and if you don't acknowledge that, you'll keep repeating the same mistakes." For a long moment, Nancy said nothing. She stared down at her hands, her mind racing with a mix of defensiveness and self-reflection. Finally, she looked up, meeting James's gaze. "What do I do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. "You start by asking yourself why you reacted the way you did. Was it stress? Bias? Something else? And then, you do the work to change. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be quick. But if you're willing to try, that's the first step." Nancy nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling over her like a heavy but necessary burden. She didn't know if she was ready to face what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel: hope. Meanwhile, Sophia and Daniel had reached the baggage claim. Daniel was bouncing on his toes, his excitement for the trip fully reignited. Sophia watched him with a mix of love and worry. She didn't want the incident on the plane to overshadow their vacation, but she couldn't ignore the knot of unease that still lingered in her chest. As she waited for their bags, a voice behind her made her turn. "Excuse me, ma'am." Sophia looked up to see James standing there, his expression calm but sincere. She straightened slightly, her hand instinctively tightening around Daniel's. "I just wanted to check in," James said, his voice low. "Are you and your son okay?" Sophia hesitated, studying him for a moment. There was no pity in his gaze, only genuine concern. She nodded slowly. "We're fine. Thank you for what you did back there. It meant a lot." James offered a small smile. "You don't need to thank me. What happened wasn't right, and I couldn't stand by and say nothing." Sophia nodded again, her eyes softening. "People usually do. Say nothing, I mean." James's smile faded slightly, his expression thoughtful. "I know, but that doesn't mean it's okay." Before Sophia could respond, Daniel tugged on her sleeve, holding up his sketchpad. "Mom, look, I drew the plane landing." Sophia smiled, brushing a hand over his curls. "It's beautiful, baby." James crouched slightly, bringing himself to Daniel's eye level. "You've got quite the talent there, young man. Keep it up." Daniel beamed, his face lighting up. "Thanks, mister." James straightened, his gaze returning to Sophia. "If you need anything at all, you let me know." Sophia hesitated before nodding. "Thank you. Really." As James turned to leave, Sophia watched him go, a small smile tugging at her lips. For the first time since the flight, she felt a glimmer of lightness, as if the weight of the day was finally beginning to lift. Back on the plane, Nancy stood in the galley, her mind replaying her conversation with James. His words had left an impression, one she couldn't shake no matter how much she tried. She glanced toward the cabin, where the cleaning crew was already beginning their work, and felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name. Regret? Shame? Maybe both. She didn't know if she could change, but for the first time, she felt the urge to try. And that, she realized, was a start. As she gathered her belongings and prepared to disembark, Nancy made a silent promise to herself. The next flight would be different. She didn't know what that meant yet, but she was determined to find out. Ripples of a small stand. As Sophia and Daniel stepped into the hotel lobby, the cool air conditioning offered a brief reprieve from the Miami heat. The lobby was bustling with tourists, their voices mingling with the sound of rolling luggage and the faint hum of distant music. Daniel clutched his sketchpad in one hand, his other hand firmly in Sophia's grasp. "Mom, can I draw by the pool later?" he asked, his eyes sparkling with anticipation. "Of course, sweetheart," Sophia replied, her voice soft but warm. She wanted this vacation to be perfect for Daniel, even if the events of the flight still lingered in her mind. As she checked in at the front desk, her thoughts drifted back to James Reed. His intervention on the plane had been unexpected, but it had meant everything in that moment. His words had cut through the isolation Sophia often felt when faced with moments of quiet prejudice. The woman at the front desk handed Sophia their room key with a bright smile. "Enjoy your stay," she chirped. Sophia nodded, taking the key and leading Daniel toward the elevators. She was determined to focus on the here and now, to make memories with her son that would overshadow the unpleasant start to their journey. Back at the airport, Nancy lingered near the employee lounge, her uniform feeling heavier than it had at the start of her shift. The conversation with James had replayed in her mind during the final leg of her duties, each word cutting deeper the more she thought about it. She had always considered herself a professional. Strict, yes, but professional. Yet James's pointed questions and Sophia's quiet, unyielding strength had forced her to confront something she had never allowed herself to face. Would you have spoken to a different child the same way? The question echoed in her mind, louder now than it had been on the plane. She wanted to dismiss it, to tell herself it wasn't about race. But deep down, she knew better. Nancy had worked in the airline industry for over a decade, And in that time, she had seen countless passengers pass through her cabin. Somewhere along the way, she had stopped seeing individuals and started seeing categories, labels that determined how she treated people before they even spoke a word. Nancy sighed heavily, leaning against the wall and staring at the floor. She thought about the way Daniel had looked at her, his wide eyes filled with confusion and hurt. She thought about Sophia, who had remained composed despite the obvious sting of the exchange. And she thought about James, whose words had been both a reprimand and an invitation to do better. For the first time in years, Nancy felt something stir within her, a deep, uncomfortable need to change. In his office at a downtown hotel, James Reed set down his briefcase and opened his laptop. His day wasn't over. He had a full agenda of meetings and reports to review. Yet his mind kept drifting back to the flight, to the quiet strength of Sophia, the resilience of Daniel, and the guarded defensiveness of Nancy. James had always been a man of action, someone who believed in the power of small stands to create larger ripples. Over the years, he had seen firsthand how unchecked behavior could perpetuate cycles of harm. He had also seen how a single moment of accountability could spark meaningful change. He leaned back in his chair, staring out the window at the city skyline. Miami was beautiful this time of year, but James couldn't shake the feeling that there was more work to be done, not just in his professional life, but in moments like these, where standing up for what was right could change the trajectory of someone's day, or even their life. James picked up his phone and opened his email. After a moment's hesitation, he began typing a message to the airline's customer service department. Sophia and Daniel settled into their hotel room, the bright Florida sun streaming through the windows. Daniel immediately ran to the window, pressing his hands against the glass as he marveled at the view of the pool below. "Look, Mom, it's huge," he exclaimed, bouncing on his toes. Sophia smiled, her heart lifting slightly at his excitement. "It sure is, baby. Why don't we change and head down there?" As Daniel scrambled to find his swim trunks, Sophia sat on the edge of the bed, taking a moment to collect herself. The flight had been a reminder of the challenges she faced as a black mother raising a child in a world that often judged him before he even spoke. But it had also been a reminder of the strength she carried, and the strength she was instilling in Daniel. She thought about James again, his calm demeanor and unwavering resolve. He hadn't just spoken up for her. He had shown her that there were allies in places she didn't expect. It was a small comfort, but a comfort nonetheless. At the airline's headquarters, the email James had sent landed in the inbox of a customer relations manager. The message was clear and detailed, outlining the incident with Nancy and the impact it had on the passengers involved. James didn't demand retribution or punishment. Instead, he emphasized the need for training, accountability, and systemic change. The manager read the email carefully, her expression growing more serious with each paragraph. She flagged the message as urgent and forwarded it to her supervisor, along with a note of her own. "This requires immediate attention." Nancy sat alone in the employee lounge, her thoughts heavy as she sipped a lukewarm cup of coffee. She couldn't shake the image of Sophia and Daniel leaving the plane. Sophia's gaze steady but distant, and Daniel clutching his sketchpad as if it were a shield. Rachel entered the lounge, her cheerful demeanor softening when she saw Nancy. "Hey," Rachel said, sitting down across from her. "You okay?" Nancy hesitated before nodding. "Just a long day." Rachel studied her for a moment, then leaned forward slightly. "That guy in first class, James, right? He seemed intense." "He was," Nancy admitted, "but he wasn't wrong." Rachel tilted her head, curious. "About what?" Nancy set down her coffee, her hands trembling slightly. "About me. About how I treat people. I didn't think I was doing anything wrong, but—" She trailed off, her voice faltering. "I was." Rachel reached across the table, placing a hand on Nancy's. "You're not a bad person, Nancy, but we all have blind spots. The important thing is what you do next." Nancy nodded slowly, her eyes glistening. For the first time in a long time, she felt the weight of accountability, not as a punishment, but as a call to be better. At the pool, Daniel splashed happily in the shallow end while Sophia washed from a nearby lounge chair. The warm sun on her skin and the sound of her son's laughter were a balm to her frayed nerves. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself relax. When she opened them, she saw Daniel waving at her, holding up a drawing he had made in his sketchpad. It was a picture of an airplane soaring through a sky filled with marshmallow clouds, with two smiling stick figures in the window. Sophia smiled, her heart swelling with love. She might not be able to protect Daniel from every harsh word or judgmental gaze, but she could teach him to rise above them, to hold on to his joy and creativity no matter what. And that, she decided, was a fight worth continuing. Seeds of change. Nancy sat in her small apartment later that evening, the silence surrounding her like a thick fog. The mug of tea in her hands had long gone cold, but she didn't notice. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the day in vivid detail. Every word James had said, every glance from Sophia, every lingering look from the passengers, they all swirled together in a relentless loop. She had spent so many years building walls around herself, thinking they were necessary to survive the demands of her job. But now those walls felt less like protection and more like a cage, keeping her from truly seeing the people she was supposed to serve. Nancy sighed and set her mug down, her hands trembling slightly. Pulling her laptop from its case, she opened a blank document. She stared at the cursor blinking against the white screen, unsure where to begin. Finally, she started typing, the words coming slowly at first, then pouring out in a rush. "To whom it may concern," she began. "Today, I realize something about myself that I've been avoiding for a long time. I've let my frustrations and assumptions color the way I interact with people. That's not who I want to be, and it's not the person I was when I started this job." She wrote for over an hour, her thoughts spilling onto the page in a mixture of apology, self-reflection, and determination. When she was done, she read it over twice before saving the document. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. For the first time, Nancy felt like she was taking a step forward. Across town, James Reed sat on his hotel balcony, the Miami skyline stretching out before him. The city's lights twinkled against the dark sky, a reminder of the countless lives unfolding just beyond his view. He sipped his whiskey slowly, his mind drifting back to the flight. He didn't consider himself a hero. What he had done on the plane was something he believed anyone should do: speak up when they saw something wrong. But the reality was that too many people didn't. James had spent years navigating corporate boardrooms, and he knew how easily people excused inaction. The email he had sent to the airline's customer service department had been acknowledged within hours. A manager had replied, thanking him for bringing the incident to their attention and assuring him that it would be investigated. But James knew words weren't enough. Real change required more than polite emails and promises. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the name of a journalist he had worked with on a corporate transparency case a year ago. After a brief hesitation, he tapped the number and waited for the call to connect. "James," the journalist greeted warmly. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I need a favor," James said, his voice steady. "There's a story I think you should hear." At the hotel pool, Daniel was curled up in a lounge chair, fast asleep under a fluffy towel. Sophia watched him with a soft smile, her heart full despite the lingering tension from earlier. The day had been long and challenging, but seeing her son's joy reminded her why she endured it all. As she scrolled through her phone, she noticed a notification, a new email in her inbox. Opening it, she was surprised to see it was from the airline. The subject line read, "Our sincere apologies." Sophia hesitated, her thumb hovering over the screen. Finally, she tapped the message, her eyes scanning the contents quickly. The email was formal but genuine, acknowledging the incident and assuring her that it would be addressed. They apologized for the distress caused and offered a voucher for a future flight. Sophia's lips pressed into a thin line. The voucher was a kind gesture, but it wasn't what she wanted. What she wanted was assurance that her son wouldn't face moments like this every time they traveled. She closed the email and set her phone down, her mind racing. She thought about Nancy, about James, about the passengers who had stayed silent. She thought about how often she had to carry the weight of these moments alone, and she felt a familiar surge of determination. Enough, she murmured to herself. Sophia picked up her phone again and began typing, her words deliberate and purposeful. She shared her experience in a post on social media, not to seek pity, but to raise awareness. She included no names, no details that could lead to retaliation, only the truth of what had happened and why it mattered. Within minutes, the post began to gain traction. Comments and messages flooded in, some offering support, others sharing similar experiences. Sophia's heart swelled with a mix of validation and sadness. Validation that her voice mattered, and sadness that so many others had endured the same. The next morning, the airline's corporate office was abuzz. Sophia's post had gone viral overnight, drawing attention from news outlets and sparking conversations about bias in customer service. Executives scrambled to issue statements and plan for damage control, but James knew this was an opportunity, not a crisis. He forwarded the viral post to the journalist he had spoken to the night before, adding a note. "This is what I was talking about. Let's shine a light on it." Within hours, the story was everywhere. News segments featured interviews with passengers who had witnessed similar incidents, and experts discussed the importance of addressing unconscious bias in industries that dealt with diverse populations. Nancy watched the coverage from her living room, her stomach churning with a mix of guilt and anxiety. She had wanted to apologize, but now the world knew what she had done. Her heart sank as she saw a clip of Sophia's post on the news, her words resonating deeply. Still, something within her shifted. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about a larger issue, one that required collective change. Nancy picked up her laptop and reopened the letter she had written the night before. She added a few final sentences before submitting it to her supervisor. For Sophia, the response to her post was overwhelming. Strangers reached out with messages of support, offering to share her story or connect her with resources. Daniel remained blissfully unaware, his world filled with drawings and poolside adventures. But Sophia felt a newfound strength. She had always taught Daniel to stand tall, to be proud of who he was. Now, she realized, she had to do the same, for him and for herself. In the weeks that followed, the airline announced new mandatory training programs focused on diversity, inclusion, and customer empathy. They also introduced a feedback system to allow passengers to report incidents anonymously. Nancy was one of the first employees to attend the training. It wasn't easy. Sitting through discussions about bias and self-reflection felt like peeling away layers she had spent years building. But by the end, she felt lighter, freer, and more committed to change. Months later, Sophia and Daniel boarded another flight, this time for a trip to visit family. As they settled into their seats, a flight attendant approached them with a warm smile. "Can I get you anything to make your trip more comfortable?" she asked. Sophia looked up, her eyes meeting the flight attendant's. For a brief moment, she hesitated, memories of the last flight flashing through her mind. But then she smiled, her voice steady and strong. "No, thank you. We're just fine." And this time, she truly meant it.